All right, welcome. My name's Andrew Brust, and what we're going to do in the next 10 minutes is cover the new data binding infrastructure in Windows Forms 2.0, specifically with regard to binding to your own objects. I'm the Chief of New Technology at 𝘍𝙬𝙬 in New York. I'm also the Microsoft Regional Director for New York and New Jersey. This is actually going to be the only slide. We're going to cut away to a demo in just a second. These are the ingredients for a successful recipe for doing object binding in Visual Studio 2005. You'll need your own classes, of course, a special object called the binding source object, optionally something called the binding navigator object, although it's very helpful, it's not strictly necessary, and finally one or more bound controls on the form. With that, let's move over to Visual Studio and take a look at a couple of classes that I have set up. These are very, very simplistic classes, but they'll go ahead and demonstrate the point. We have a customer class and an order class. The customer class has three very simple string-based properties, one for each for customer ID, first name, and last name. In addition to that, we have a property called orders, which is based on a new type, a new generic type called a binding list. So our orders property is a binding list of type order. This last line of code that's commented out we'll come back to at the end. Let's move over to the order class. This class in many ways is even simpler. It just has two properties on it. An order ID property that's integer based to uniquely identify the order object, and a customer ID property to reference back to the parent customer object. Speaking of that parent, we've set up this class specifically so that its constructor requires a customer ID to be passed to it. That way, there's no way to create an order that doesn't belong to an already existing customer. It turns out that's going to cause a little bit of a challenge in our data binding scenario, but with a carefully crafted piece of code, we're going to be able to meet that challenge. Let's move over now to just a blank form, and let's get out of full screen mode. I'll point out to you that in the Visual Studio toolbox now, you will see a number of the objects I mentioned to you. The binding source, the binding navigator, the data grid view control, as well as the data set. Now we could individually drag these onto our form, but as it turns out, that's not going to be necessary. And it's not going to be necessary because we now have something called the data sources window, which allows us to do drag and drop operations that automate a lot of the individual object placement. What's on the data sources window by default are the data sets and data tables that are built into my project. I have a couple of data sets and they're showing up. But what we're going to want to do is add our own object to the data sources window. So we'll pick the data source config wizard. We'll specify that we want to add an object to the data sources window. We'll drill down and go specifically to my customer class. We'll click Next, we'll click Finish, and you'll see the customer class pop up on the data sources window. Notice each of the properties of the customer object appear as bindable fields, and that the orders collection within it appears almost as a child table, and its properties appear as bindable fields as well. So in order to do the data binding, I'm going to click the drop-down button next to the customer table and specify that I want to bind in details mode so that each field gets its own bound control. I'll then quickly do a drag and drop onto the form, and automatically created for me are the binding source object, the binding navigator object, three different bound controls, and a auto-generated UI that's actually part of the binding navigator as well. Let's take a quick look at the property window just to get a sense of what's going on here. You will notice that for the binding source object, that its data source is set to my customer class. For the binding navigator object, its binding source property is set to the binding source object already on the form. And for the individual bound controls, for example, the first name text box, if we take a look at its data bindings property by drilling down, we take a look at its text property, we see that we are bound to the first name property of the customer binding source object. So you can wire those properties all up yourself, or you can use the drag and drop to get it done. We still have to bind to the child orders, so for that I can simply do another drag and drop of the orders, and you'll see that automatically I get a data grid view control. The data grid view control is the successor to today's data grid control. You'll notice that it doesn't have the default row for adding a new record, and you'll further notice that the orders binding source object that was created automatically for me has its allow new property set to false. That is specifically because the constructor in the order class requires that value to be passed, and the binding source has no intrinsic way of knowing what that value is. However, what we can do is manually flip that to true, and with, again, one well strategically placed line of code, we'll be able to handle that slight anomaly. I'm going to take you to another form here that's just a more evolved version of the form we were just looking at. All the controls on the form are the same. And really the only difference is that there is some code that's already been put in the form. Let's go full screen, take a look at that. In the form load, you see I am first of all doing some maintenance on a locally declared customer's binding list object. And what we're doing in the form load is adding one arbitrary object to that collection. We're also adding a couple of orders to the orders collection for that customer, and that's specifically so we can have a little data to work with. Then I'm manually setting the data source property of the binding source object to our binding list of customers. This line of code will turn out to be key. When the user clicks in the orders data grid view control to add a new order, this adding new event, which is an event of the binding source object itself, will fire automatically. And what we're going to do is create our own order object here, and we are going to reference the current property of the binding source object to get a reference to the customer that's currently being displayed, reference its customer ID property, pass that to the constructor. Let's go ahead now and run this and see how it goes. If this works, we'll be almost done, but I'll show you one more tweak to all of this to make it so that this logic that's right now in the UI is actually moved over to the customer class. So our application comes up. I'll pick demo and object binding so we can take a look. There's our sample data that we put in the form load. Notice when I click in the last row in the grid view control, the customer ID is automatically entered in there for me, and that's as a direct result of the code we had in there. I'll click add new. We'll add one more customer. We'll call her Amy Smith. And you'll notice as soon as I click in the grid, her customer ID, Smith, is copied into the row as well. So that's all well and good, and we're really almost done. Again, just one little tweak to make this all work really nicely. For the demo purposes, I'm going to comment this line of code out. I'm going to go into the customer class. Let's go full screen one more time. And this line of code at the bottom that I told you we'd come back to, we're going to uncomment that. So because the orders property is managed as a binding list, this object, the binding list of orders, also has its own adding new event. We'll trap that, and we'll put the same type of logic we had in the form, but we'll put it right here in the class. That way, any form that binds to this class will automatically have that validation logic and that primary foreign key kind of maintenance set up. So let's just run a quick regression test to make sure everything still works, and then we'll be all done. Demos, object binding. We'll click in the last row here, and it looks like everything's working. Let's just add that one other customer. And hopefully her name comes in as well. Looks good. So now you've seen how to bind to objects, how to bind to binding lists, and how to put all of the tricky logic inside the classes yourself. That's all for me, Andrew Brust, and I hope you enjoyed this 10 minutes.